This is your reminder that the BBC has yet to address the consistent transphobic leanings in its news coverage, and while the team behind Doctor Who is not connected to this in any way since this is a BBC-owned property, I'm going to keep pointing it out until the problem gets resolved. Links in a pinned comment below if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'll stop saying it when it stops being a problem. Oh boy. You thought the Chibnall era was rough. So, something occurred to me a little while ago. Since last year, over in the Break Room of Geeks, that's my secondary channel, check that out if you're not subscribed already, I went through and reviewed all the entries in Colin Baker's second season as the Sixth Doctor, aka The Trial of a Time Lord. And since I marathoned those, that actually meant that I've seen every Sixth Doctor story that was aired on television. Now, normally, when I've wrapped up these things, I have a tendency to like to do top 10s. Like the Ninth Doctor, I just did it as a ranking because he only had the one series, and I count two-parters as one story. But I've done it for the 10th Doctor, I've done it for the 12th, I've done it for the 11th. I think I did it for the 13th. I think so. I'm having a hard time remembering now. But it's something I've generally done. But I couldn't really do that for the 6th Doctor, for a couple of reasons. The first being, depending on how you count his episodes, there either aren't 10 or there's barely more than 10, depending on whether you count Trial of a Time Lord as one giant thing, or even if you break it up into its constituent parts, that's 11 total stories that the guy had. Even chopping it down to like a top 5, I just didn't wanna, because they're not good. Like, none of them are good. Not truly. There are ones that are good for the time. There are ones that have good aspects to them. Obviously, that speech he gets to give in the towards the end of Trial of a Time Lord is fantastic.
10 million years of absolute power. That's what it takes to be really corrupt.
There are good moments and bits and things, but like, there's none of these episodes that I'm ever like, I want to watch that again. None of them. So to me, at this point, it seems like the more fitting thing to do is to look at that era as a whole and go, why doesn't this work? Because the natural inclination would be to say, well, Colin Baker wasn't good as the Doctor. But if you have looked into any media for Doctor Who outside of the show itself, then you know that's not true. He's been wildly successful in novels, in Big Finish audio especially. He has some amazing stuff. Some of my favorite audio adventures are Sixth Doctor adventures. They're fantastic. But his era on TV does not work at all. But he's not the problem. Or at least, he's not the entire problem. Here's what I'll grant about the Sixth Doctor. He is not a characterization of the Doctor that is something you could just drop into any setting and still have him work. He needs context in order to work. In order to explain that, let's contrast him a little bit with the Fourth Doctor, Tom Baker, aka the one whose scarf I'm wearing at the moment. Now, the thing with Tom Baker is, with the exception of some stuff towards the very end of his run where you could tell he was kind of tired and was ready to be done doing this.
Yes, it's alarming, isn't it?
Up until that point, pretty much any story he was in, he was going to be good in, even if the story wasn't great. Heck, you can look at his very first one, Robot, which I don't think is a very good story. I just don't. It's predictable, it's cheesy in a way that I find grating rather than entertaining, but he's phenomenal in it.
Well, nothing's perfect. Have to take the rough with the smooth.
Well, you can't go rushing off and leave them in the lurch.
Can't I? Goodbye.
Because his take on the Doctor was just engaging and wonderful and fun to watch no matter what was going on around him. Colin Baker's Doctor is not like that, and I think his era proves it. Because they went in with the intention to make a deliberately more abrasive Doctor.
Then stay behind! This is work for heroes, not for faint-hearted girls!
And Big Finish has proved since that that is not a bad idea, and Colin Baker has proved he can sell that idea. So it can't just be him on his own, but that Doctor in particular is a character that you can't just drop in any setting and he works in a vacuum. He needs to be in a setting where the other pieces are constructed around him in a way that makes this version of the Doctor work. And his era didn't have that. So, well, what was going on? Well, I'll come back to the abrasiveness of the Doctor himself. There's also the way his era kicked off. A lot of people will point to the very first story that he was in, The Twin Dilemma, as being kind of patient zero for everything that went wrong. And the thing is, some of the things people will say about it, I don't think are quite accurate. Because it's pretty common amongst Doctor Who fans who are familiar with Classic to lay the blame of Colin Baker's Doctor not being accepted and being just flat out rejected was partially due to when The Twin Dilemma aired. Because normally, the way it worked most times before and since, a Doctor regenerates kind of at the end of, so like end of a season, or in the modern era, maybe at the end of a special. But then you move on to the next one. With the fifth Doctor, he regenerated not in the last story of his last season, but in the second to last story of his final season. And then the actual last story that went out that season was Colin Baker's first episode. And a lot of fans will point to that and go, that was the problem. And the thing is, like, it contributed to the problem, but that in and of itself is not a bad idea. What it is a high risk idea, because if you nail it, then that means that you are going to have your audience foaming at the mouth for more after the break between seasons. However, if you blow it, if you don't land it correctly, or if the story just flatly sucks, which, yeah, Twin Dilemma, even aside from the fact that it is coming off of a very strong story that preceded it, is just not good. I mean, it's not. The supporting performances aren't great. The villain is uninteresting. His scheme barely makes any sense. There's the wobbly set thing, which was an on and off Doctor Who problem for most of the time, but like it's very evident. It's just not good, even before you get to the issues with how Baker was introduced, and we'll get to that. But it's not inherently a bad idea to end the season introducing the new Doctor. It's just, that's a heavy gamble. You got to knock it out of the park for that to work. And they didn't. Because if they'd waited, for the start of the next season, then that means, yes, people will have the intervening time to miss the fifth Doctor, but then, to kind of have their grieving process, and then come in to the new season, go, okay, let's see. And then even if the first story stinks, you're like, all right, well, let's come back next week, see if they do better. However, when you end the season on Colin Baker's first story, then that means you haven't given the audience much time to process and go through whatever grieving they need to do with the exit of the previous Doctor. You're rushing right into the next thing. And then if you don't nail it, which they don't, suddenly there's a huge gap during which the audience is very much not anticipating. Because it's easy, if Twin Dilemma had been at the start of a season, to go, okay, that wasn't great, but let's see what's going on next week. Are you as likely to say, let's come back and see if they do any better months down the line after being massively let down? No. Kind of makes it more likely you're going to go, I think this Doctor is not for me. I think I'm good. I think I'm done. And some audiences did. So what was done specifically with him in that first episode? Because there's actually a very specific scene that a lot of people will point to. And I actually think that in and of itself, while it didn't help, again, given the placement of when Twin Dilemma aired, this wasn't a great idea and it didn't help the situation. But Fans will point to this as being like, that's the moment everything went to hell, and I am inclined to disagree. Now, granted, I wasn't there at the time, so they may be speaking for what the feel amongst fans at the time was, and they may be speaking for it accurately. I can't. I can only give my impression watching it significantly later. But there is a bit where the Sixth Doctor kind of loses his mind a little bit and starts to strangle his companion, Perry. And a lot of people point to that as, well, almost kind of like a Hank Pym slapping Janet Van Dyne moment, like a permanent stain on the character that he couldn't shake off. While I will grant it's a little much, this is, I would say, the most that the classic era rolled with the idea that post-regeneration, the Doctor is out of sorts. They leaned into that before. Fifth Doctor leaned into that a fair bit in his first story, Castrovalva.
I'm the Doctor. Or will be if this regeneration works out.
And there's a little bit of that in the Seventh Doctor's first story as well, but this one leans into it hard. So I'm disinclined to agree simply because I don't think that this moment in and of itself would be viewed as harshly if there wasn't a bigger issue going forward with the relationship between the Doctor and Perry. I'm definitely going to be coming back to that, stick a pin in it. That moment in and of itself is uncomfortable, but it's not the only thing he does either. He kind of tries to come out of that and do better, even within the episode itself, despite being very brash and very bad at admitting that he's done something wrong. But it's not really indicated like that's who the Doctor is now. He's someone who strangles his companion. Like, no, something is wrong. That is clearly communicated within the episode itself. So that moment would not have been such a problem if it weren't for what I ultimately think is the big overriding issue with the Sixth Doctor's era, which is that it really feels like the writers f***ing hated Perry. What it feels like watching, so I'm not saying this is what happened, but what it feels like is it feels like there was a writing team who was brought in and were excited to write for the Fifth Doctor, only to find out that they came in right at the point of regeneration, and that the Fifth Doctor, he regenerated, he died, saving this companion who just barely started traveling in the TARDIS, and they decided to blame her for the fact that they now had to write for a Doctor they didn't want to write for, and they decided to make her life miserable and to use the Doctor as the vehicle for torturing and tormenting her for the rest of this run. I swear, it really does feel like the writer's room has the biggest grudge against Perry. It is unsettling. Because as I said, that initial moment, that of him putting his hands on her neck, it's not great as a moment in and of itself, but it's recoverable. What makes it not recover, though, is the fact that their whole dynamic very much feels like she's actively scared of him throughout most of their time. There really is barely any point where it seems like she actually wants to be traveling with him. There are a couple of points at the very start of some stories where she seems a little bit more relaxed, but one of the big recurring things of this era is that they'll encounter something, that will intrigue the Doctor and make her very uncomfortable. And she's like, Doctor, can we please leave? And his answer is always no, and brush her off and ignore her.
Possible or not, I want to get away from here.
You're absolutely right. We must find out what's going on here.
He does not care. He's not even reassuring. He's not even telling her, oh, don't worry about it, Perry. Everything will be fine. He's just telling her, no, we're not going to leave. That feels like such a fundamentally broken relationship. It feels like you are watching an abusive relationship and someone who wants to leave but doesn't know how.
I'm scared, Doctor. You don't seem to understand that.
It is deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And Perry is put through the absolute ringer right up to how she exits the show, which gets retconned at the very end of Trial of a Time Lord. But spoilers, the original intent was she died. So it really feels like the writers absolutely hated her. Did they? I don't think so. I think it was this overall miscalculation of trying to make the Doctor more abrasive, more dangerous, which is a not awful thing to try and do. Some of the stronger moments of modern era Doctor Who have had the Doctor feeling dangerous. Think of Christopher Eccleston snapping at the Dalek in the episode titled Dalek.
Rid the universe of your filth. Why don't you just die?
Think of the 10th Doctor, the Time Lord Victorious, or what he did to the Family of Blood.
The fury of the Time Lord.
The 11th Doctor staring down someone and reminding them,
good men don't need rules. Today is not the day to find out why I have so many.
The 12th Doctor shouting at Isildur.
The Doctor is no longer here. You are stuck with me.
Even Whittaker's Doctor, in a speech that I don't like the context of, and I really don't like the episode it's in, but even her in Haunting of Villa Diodati, taking that moment of feeling like she's prepared to go to a darker place.
With me at the summit, in the stratosphere, alone. Left to choose.
There is definitely mileage in a Doctor that has some darkness and that you're afraid of. But the thing is, the difference between what was done with Colin Baker and what was done with the other Doctors far more successfully later on, and actually it's not even a modern era thing, Sylvester McCoy's Doctor could be terrifying at times.
End my life?
No.
Why not?
I don't know.
You don't, do you?
But the reason it works with them is it's not their default. It's something that is there that they can tap into, that they can slip into even, if it feels like they're losing a little bit of control of themselves. But the 6th Doctor in his TV appearances just kind of exists, disregarding the humanity of his companion, seeming to have very little interest in helping people, not really seeming to have fun. He just seems annoyed and frustrated and irritated by everything. By his companion, by the people he has to help, by life. He's not fun to be around. But, again, that can be made to work with the correct context. I tend to point to, with Big Finish, the best companion that he has. While she is not in my absolute favorite Big Finish story with him in it, Evelyn Smythe was the perfect companion for him, especially after trying to make Perry work, and it didn't work. Although, to be fair, Big Finish did make Perry work better than she did in the TV series and the stories where she came back. But Evelyn Smythe was the best thing for the 6th Doctor. And if you don't know anything about her, if you don't listen to Big Finish audio, she was an older woman. She was a history professor. And more to the point, she wasn't impressed by the Doctor, and she didn't put up with his shit.
I wonder if you'd mind accompanying me to my ship for a few tests.
The students get warned about people like you on their first day.
She was a little bit of a low-key precursor to Donna in some ways. She does not put up with him at all. If she says something and he's not listening to her, she'll make sure that he hears her. Whereas Perry just rolled over. And the vibe you usually got was she did it out of fear. Because she's afraid of him. But again, the idea of bringing mystery and darkness to the Doctor is not a bad idea. They just did it badly. And as much as I wish this wasn't the case, I kind of said earlier, I don't think there's any good episodes from his era, and I kind of stand by that. I think the one that tends to get defended the most is Revelation of the Daleks, but while there's some decent stuff, that one's probably got the best storytelling chops of any of the episodes that aired during his time. The Doctor doesn't need to be there, though. Like, most of what goes on is this internal conflict between two different divisions of Daleks, and there's this whole scheme with this assassin, and there's Davros with his machinations, and the Doctor spends literally the entire first part of this walking to where everything else is going on. I suppose that's the other thing. You notice I only mentioned there's 2 parts in that. Overall, the era got a bit experimental, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, but I think they were experimenting too many things at once. They were already getting experimental with how the Doctor was being portrayed and the dynamic that he had with the companion, but they also got experimental with the format. His first full season, Doctor Who had always been about 24-minute episodes, anywhere from 4 to, I don't know what the high end was, 10? I think 10 was as long as they got, 10-part stories. His first full season, they did 2-parters at double length. So same total amount of minutes, but completely different format. And then the next season, Trial of a Time Lord, they went back to the shorter episodes and 4-part stories as kind of the standard, but they tried to do this continuous overarching story and this framing device for the entirety of the season, which was another very new and experimental idea. But again, it's too many things at once. They're experimenting with the format. At the same time, they're experimenting with the characterization. At the same time that they're experimenting with when they even had him get introduced at all in terms of when his first episode was aired. That's a situation where, like, and again, I'm not saying any show, and I'm especially not saying Doctor Who shouldn't get experimental. It should. That's the lifeblood of something that's going to run this long. You have to shake it up and you need to try new things, if only to reaffirm why the reason you do it the way that it had been done before is the best way to go. At least you tried something else. You still learned something from it. But generally, if you're going to go experimental, you don't want to experiment with too many fundamentals at once, because then if stuff isn't working, well, which of the things we changed isn't what's working? Oh, crap. Are none of them working? Are some working, but others are dragging them down? Which do we keep? Which do we ditch? And there's very much that panic sense with the replacement of Colin Baker by Sylvester McCoy, because his dismissal happened very suddenly. And to the point that he refused to come back to the start of the next season and film a regeneration scene for Sylvester McCoy to take over. And frankly, I don't blame him. He came in and he's trying. He's giving what is, in terms of actual acting, a solid performance, but it's of a character that isn't working in the context that he's been built into. Again, largely coming back to Perry and how absolutely miserable she is. Like, the Doctor was already having an issue with kind of putting the companions through the ringer. Both the Doctor as a character and definitely the show as a whole. This had already kind of started happening in the 5th Doctor season. You could point to Adric dying, but honestly, I'd point to Tegan, who, like, by the time she left, she was just like, I can't.
It stopped being fun, Doctor.
Like, she just seemed, frankly, traumatized. And I don't blame her at all, but the darkness level with the 5th Doctor and where it was starting to go was something that was creeping in, but then it's just full bore all throughout the 6th Doctor's time, and there's no real respite from it. The show got more violent, like right down to there being more actual blood on the screen. And this darker, gruffer Doctor that just doesn't seem to care about his companion at all. And again, in and of itself, we know that characterization isn't the problem, but he has to be in a setting where that works, in a story where that works, with a companion where that works. It's kind of like, okay, see if you'll go with me on this. It's kind of like how in the last 30, 40 years or so, the depiction of Batman has gotten increasingly dark. And if you read the comics, it gets more and more out of place when Batman shows up in other people's books, because it's gotten to the point where Batman is so dark, so dour, so much of the time that he really kind of only works in Gotham these days. Because Gotham is a world built to accommodate somebody like this in the way Batman is frequently depicted now. But you put him in a Justice League story, just have him appear somewhere else, one of two things happens. Either you have to darken everything around him so that he doesn't stand out, or he's going to stick out a little bit like a sore thumb. Like, I was a bit relieved when the news broke a while back that the intended continuation of The Batman, the one that Matt Reeves directed with Robert Pattinson, is going to be isolated in a bubble and is not intended to integrate with the new DC cinematic stuff that James Gunn is doing. A lot of which indicates that it wants to be lighter and more fun, especially if his Suicide Squad and Peacemaker are any indication. And I'm glad they're sectioning off the Batman, because I cannot picture the Robert Pattinson Batman interacting with just people. Having friends, for that matter. Like, he works in The Batman. I was shocked how much I liked that movie. I thought I was going to hate it. It works really well because all the pieces are designed to fit together. But if you take him out of that and put him somewhere else, it's going to be like, that's not working at all. And I kind of feel the same way about Colin Baker. So I guess I'm saying Colin Baker, the 6th Doctor, is the Batman of Doctor Who. I'm not even sure I know what that means, but yeah. That's what I'm going with. But it's a relief. It is a shame to watch this era, but it is then a relief to explore things like Big Finish. And if you want recommendations, if you've never heard the Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker, in Big Finish stories, the primary recommendation I'm going to make to people, if you're not familiar with audio drama at all, is going to be Jubilee. This is actually an audio story that was the inspiration for the episode Dalek from Christopher Eccleston's season. And Jubilee is pretty much most of the things that are in Dalek are in Jubilee, but Jubilee also has a lot more going on. They kind of condensed it down to one plot line. But that'll give you like a starting sense, because you'll kind of know at least certain aspects of the story as you get a handle on the format and the performance and everything. That also has Evelyn Smythe, so you'll get a sense of her. It also so happens that what is currently still my all-time favorite audio piece from Big Finish is the Sixth Doctor story, and that is Holy Terror. And that is where my favorite Doctor Who quote comes from, which actually I have a little embroidered thing right there that a fan sent me. It doesn't matter to whom the cruelty is directed, the cruelty itself is wrong. The Sixth Doctor of the show, if he'd said that, I think it would have come across as disingenuous. In Big Finish, he's still abrasive. He is self-righteous. He has a massive ego, but he won't tolerate cruelty. On the show, it felt like he was the vehicle through which cruelty was committed against Perry in specific rather frequently. Big Finish knew what to do with him, because it's not a complete redo of the character. It's a redo of the setting. It is a redo of the dynamic. It is a redo of taking what was there that always had the potential to work and actually building something where it does. So if you're going to try and get into the Sixth Doctor, that's what I'm going to recommend, because I honestly, I can't really recommend any of these. If you want to highlight, look up the Sixth Doctor's angry rant at the Time Lords from near the end of Trial of a Time Lord. Just watch that speech in isolation, because that's as good as his entire run gets, is that moment. Trial of a Time Lord, honestly, it's stronger overall than the previous season, but it really doesn't pull together. And even there, it's better, but that's grading on the curve of none of this is very good. When I think about any of it in a vacuum at all, like these aren't good stories. The best Colin Baker televised story, it wouldn't even make a short list of good episodes, much less great ones, when you put it in the context of the rest of even just classic Who. Don't even bother with modern. And that's a shame. But thank goodness he got a reprieve. Because this era on TV, whew, holy rough going, Batman. All right. So those are my thoughts on the Sixth Doctor's era, why it didn't work. Again, people who were there at the time will probably speak more as to like the marketing and could give you a more accurate idea of the actual feeling fans had in the moment at the time. I can't do that. I can only do it from the perspective I have. But whatever your thoughts are, if you want to share them, drop them down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. You know, the YouTube things, they help too. But what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Time for me to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Goddess Elida, Oliver B., Turok, The Thing That Goes Doink in the Anime, Ruth, Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris. That was a new one, that's why I paused. Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Robin Powell, Twisted Wishes, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Pau Barabajagal, and Mara G. If you want to support me as well and help keep these little buggers fed, check out my Patreon. Thanks so much.